Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today is another epic poem review, which I haven't done very many of these on the channel, but notably I have covered Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, which is a lot of why I'm now reviewing the Aeneid by Virgil. This one's going to be a little bit of a harder one for me, and that's because I think I have a rather different opinion overall than I both expected to and than I obviously wanted to. I enjoyed writing my Goodreads review on this a good bit, even though it was relatively negative, and spoiler alert for this review here. But even though I enjoyed writing that particular version of my review for this book, I'm a bit less enthused about recording this video here. Oddly enough, I know that probably sounds strange, but it is the truth nonetheless. Anyway, I don't think I really need to say much more here at the start of the video, so let's give this a go. I will start by saying the good things about the Aeneid, the things that I did like, the things that are enjoyable, because there are a number of these things actually. The main great thing about the Aeneid is that it is a very cool mishmash of the Iliad and the Odyssey together. I think it would be pretty difficult to really appreciate this for what it is without knowing Homer ahead of time, because of the fact that it combines a lot of that stuff together. Virgil definitely wears the influence of the Homeric tale on his sleeve, because by the time this was being written, Homer would have also been very well known, very well respected at the time. So it makes sense that this kind of calls back to a lot of that stuff, calls back to those familiar epics and kind of rewrites them for a new audience, where the Iliad and Odyssey particularly are written for the Greeks. The Aeneid is definitely written for the Romans. Now, in what specific ways is the Aeneid the cool mishmash of the Iliad and the Odyssey together that I mentioned earlier? Well, it's because a lot of the back half of the book is very Iliad forward, battle scenes and this type of stuff. The way that the Iliad is basically just a long kind of like siege during a portion of it. There's a lot of these battles. There's some game stuff going on. By games, I mean like, say, like Olympic style games. Not quite necessarily that kind of thing, but you're not horribly far off if you imagine that. And then the first half of the Aeneid is very Odyssey forward, kind of voyaging, being not necessarily lost at sea, but recounting a tale as part of it, coming up across, various different mythological creatures and beings as part of it, and making an escape to a certain degree as part of it, to the point that a portion of the Odyssey-esque part of the Aeneid is actually visits a pretty similar, if not the same. Actually, there is at least one part that visits the same location as one of the locations that Odysseus visits in the Odyssey, and both of those tales are actually recounted by those characters rather than being explored in real time, which is a pretty funny not so coincidence there. I'm pretty sure Virgil probably did that on purpose, but using the familiarity with the Homeric tale for a Roman story is a lot of what makes the Aeneid cool as a concept, because looking at it a little bit more historically, you understand why this exists, where it exists, and why, and that's all really cool stuff, actually. Furthermore, the Aeneid definitely has its own brushes with the epic and the brutal in the way that both the Iliad and the Odyssey do, particularly the Odyssey on the brutal side of things, but that's just a particular example. I would say a few standout examples of kind of what the Aeneid does right at particular times is that, like, books 2 and 4, for example, are really particular standouts in which the entire portion of both of those, every single line of those, is really, really great and has some really standout material. Book 6 is very good as well, contains an entire sequence that is just awesome. Book 2 is the actual Trojan horse story. No, the Iliad, in fact, does not contain the siege and fall of Troy. That particular legend, that particular bit of the cultural zeitgeist actually comes from this bad boy, which is probably going to be a shock to people who haven't read any of these books. Poems, I suppose. So that's very cool to experience in book 2. And like I said, book 2 is actually really great, not least because you get to experience that in more or less its original format. Book 4 is a really great story of effective emotional drama, the kind of relationship aspect of that. And you're probably not thinking what you should be thinking when I say relationship aspect. because it's kind of hard to explain in just a brief review of this sort. But the general drama aspect of book 4, I suppose you could call these songs, or might be called cantos. It might depend on your translation. There are 12 books in this, 12 books in the Aeneid compared to the 24 books in each the Iliad and the Odyssey. So that's what I'm calling them in here because that's what they're called in my edition. The drama of book 4 is very good and almost worth reading the Aeneid entirely for, even though, you can read it pretty early in the book. So if you don't want to read the whole poem, you can just read the first the first 4 books of this and have a relatively self-contained portion of the story. And the first 4 books are actually all good to great. So, hint, hint at the recommendation later in this video. Book 6 also, like I said, had a very great sequence in which Aeneas traverses hell to some extent, and the evocative imagery of hell here is actually quite good. Like I said, it's effective and enjoyable, so book 6 is really cool for those reasons. Books 10 to 11 in particular, as far as the back half of the book goes, were very, very good as far as certain battle sequences and negotiations and stuff of that kind of sort. Very good. Definitely felt very Iliadic during those 2 books, during portions of them, I should say. Whereas some of the other battle sequences a little bit earlier than that or a little bit later than that kind of lost that Iliadic charm that I really enjoyed. But in general, I would say most of the books in here were halfway awesome. And I say halfway awesome pretty specifically because we're going to move into the bad now, the bad of the Aeneid, the things that I didn't like about this. The first thing is that the Aeneid has, in my opinion, in my interpretation, my experience, I guess, pretty major pacing issues. And that's because halfway awesome was a very specific choice of words, because right around half of not every single, because I said that books 2 and 4 are both really great, but nearly every book, I would say probably 7 or 8 of the 12 books of the Aeneid are halfway great and halfway not actually. Most of these books were supremely overlong. I found myself often getting tired with each book right around the 500 to 600 line mark, which for most of these books was right around halfway through, depending on how you looked at it, maybe a little bit more than halfway through. Pushing through each book was a little bit tougher than it needed to be, and given that they're split this way in books, you would think that they're kind of meant to be read in kind of one sitting this way. If someone's getting exhausted halfway through the book in just about every single book, that's kind of a structural pacing issue with the way that it's structured, and I kind of know that this is basically a structural problem, at least for me, because most of the books in the Aeneid also tended to cover 2 mostly separate sequences, actually. Book 6, that I talked about having a little bit of a journey through hell, only about half of that book is a journey through hell, and the rest of it is something completely different, completely unrelated. And the entire back half of the Aeneid features this problem, where the first half is something that I enjoyed a lot, and then the back half was I'm exhausted, I don't really want to be reading this, and it's not even doing what the first half was doing and that I was enjoying, and I just wanted to do that some more. The way that it's structured into 12 books just doesn't feel right. I feel like the Aeneid should have been split probably into 18 books, so that many of these books that feel overlong or that kind of are 2 different books in and of themselves, despite being scrunched together, could be split. The whole back half could probably have been split into a couple books each, and that genuinely would have been fine, even if book 6 wasn't split that way. But you could have done something in here to make it 18, 20, 24 books even, potentially, and it would have been a lot better for that. Not only would these individual books have been a little bit shorter and therefore a little easier and quicker to get through, it also would have meant that the pacing of that would have felt a little bit more like Homer, because even in Homer, even in the Iliad, some of those books got to be pretty long as well in some places, but not always, and the Odyssey especially has some quite short books in there. Even when you have sequences, multiple books in a row in Homer's work, where multiple books are following basically the same kind of storyline and just going on and adding to that, it made sense to split them where those things were split. Whereas in Virgil, you have multiple books that are really long and trying to be long that don't need to be, that are covering different things that could have been split into multiple books and would have been better off for it, where even if they're covering kind of the same thing, where like books 10 and 11 feature a lot of really similar material, could have still been split into 4 books and been better off for it. So there's a lot of this just kind of structural pacing issues that I really struggled with in here, and maybe that's a me problem, but I just found myself being really frustrated with the Aeneid, and not even just because of these problems. I also found that I was frustrated with the story at times, probably because Aeneas, the main character of the Aeneid, is nowhere near as cool or charismatic or enjoyable to follow as a protagonist as Odysseus is, as an example. The journey borrows a little bit too much from Homer at times. Like I said, that front half, even though the front half is really good, it borrows a little bit too much from Odysseus's journey, a little bit too much from Homer's telling of that, for it to feel like its own unique thing. There are portions of it that are just like, this is just kind of ripping off the Odyssey. And I think Virgil definitely meant this more to be a little bit of homage, referencing and telling a story like the Homeric tale for his own audience. And at the time, I suppose that probably would have been really cool, but a couple thousand years removed from that, it's a little bit harder to appreciate to the same extent for me. Additionally, just as a random aside here, the Aeneid is slightly unpolished. And this is, of course, because Virgil died before he had the chance to revise the text of it, which is unfortunate. The story is complete. It's just was never revised, made to be the exact version that he wanted. But that meant that Virgil never actually wanted the Aeneid to be published, which is funny. Imagine a world in which we don't have the Trojan horse as part of the cultural zeitgeist just because the Aeneid doesn't actually get published, actually following Virgil's wishes in that way. So that's kind of a funny way to think of things. I can't imagine that all of my problems with the story would have been fixed with a revision, especially since most of them have to do with the structure of it. And that seems like it was probably something very intentional on Virgil's part. I just personally had a really hard time enjoying some of that stuff. But now we're going to move into the ugly, which is probably going to be a really unpopular take. More unpopular than simply disliking the Aeneid in general. Don't read the Fagles translation of this. Just don't do it. I'm open and honest about the fact that I didn't enjoy the Aeneid, but I would not be surprised if a fairly significant part of this was because of Fagles' translation. Maybe it's just because I read Homer from the Peter Green translation, which feels authentic despite being a pretty modern voice, and also is still like beautiful and wowing and poetic at times. Like, it was genuinely something that I enjoyed reading. I never enjoyed actually reading Fagles' writing here at all. And for something that's meant to be poetic, and especially something that's, in the original language at least, meant to be recited and told to people, something that's a little bit more of an oral tradition, or at least in Virgil's time, as equally an oral tradition in the way that he would perform it for people as it was a written tradition, compared to Homer, which was strictly oral. So that explains why that kind of stuff had to be beautiful to actually read, because it was meant to be beautiful to the ear. It was meant to be musical. It was sung originally. The Aeneid does not really follow in the vibe of any of that. And at this point, I'm really grateful that I did not read Homer in Fagles' translation, because I can't imagine I would have liked it nearly as much. I can't imagine it would have been nearly as good, just because of the way that the Aeneid is compared to Homer. And I know they're different stories. I know they're different authors, but stylistically, not least because Virgil was borrowing pretty heavily from Homer, I feel like I probably should have been enjoying reading this a lot more than I was enjoying reading this, and I'm almost certain that Fagles' translation more or less ruined the Aeneid for me. It's really readable, but I think that the prose never stood out. There was maybe one sentence where I was like, hey, you're onto something there, and that was it. Literally it. And by one sentence, I actually mean one line, which isn't even a full sentence in a poem of this type. The writing felt definitely overly utilitarian, and I think that that is a Fagles problem and not a Aeneid problem. So as my recommendation, this thing is a little bit hard to recommend. So despite my personal lack of enjoyment overall, I do still recommend the Aeneid, which is probably going to sound a little bit weird, but there's a couple reasons. Reason number one for recommending this is that I know a minimum of 2 people who liked the Aeneid more than the Iliad or the Odyssey. Now, I know at least one of those people read all 3 of these with the Robert Fagles translations, so I don't know if that means that the Aeneid with Fagles is better than Homer with Fagles. So I don't know if that's like a Fagles-specific issue, but the fact that I know at least 2 people, maybe 3, who enjoyed the Aeneid more than Homer says something. It says that, like, I might be in the minority here. I don't have enough data points to be able to, like, actually see one way or the other whether that's the case, but it seems like it could definitely be the case. And reason number 2 is that my problems with it could very, very well have just been me problems. It could have been the fact that I wanted this to be a little bit more like Homer than it was, even though one of my criticisms was that it borrows too much from Homer. It could have been that I was wanting something structurally more like Homer, even though Virgil is his own artist, he's his own voice. It could have been that the Fagles translation was genuinely just not good enough to stand up to my experience with Peter Green's translation of Homer. It could have just been as simply that I read this at the wrong place, wrong time, or something like that, because I think that there's at least a little bit of that in there as well. I know that someday I will be rereading the Aeneid with a different translation whenever I circle back around to and reread Homer, and I'm going to try to find a translation that is similar to Peter Green to some extent. I'm going to try to study various different translations, find what sounds similar to that style that I would like, and then reread the Aeneid then, so that I'm in that Homeric thing. Like one of the friend that I said who read all 3 of these, both of the Homer stories and the Aeneid in Fagles' translation, read them all back to back basically, and I've been meaning to get to the Aeneid for a couple years at this point. So I don't know if, like, there's a little bit of separation of time here in which it wasn't long enough for me to forget my experience with the Iliad or the Odyssey enough for this to work, and it also wasn't short enough for me to be able to rely on that to enhance it enough, as opposed to just being a comparison piece. Like, there's a lot of variables here that I think go into me not really enjoying this when I feel like I probably should have. So I'm going to reread this someday. I'm not going to read it in Fagles. I'm going to read something that's a little bit more similar to what I wanted, or from what I got with Homer, and therefore what I want from Virgil. All I know at this point is that I do not recommend Fagles, and I retroactively do not recommend reading Homer with the Fagles translations, because if they are anything near as similar to this as I predict they would be on account of being the same translator, I doubt they would be any good, quite frankly. I know Fagles is a popular translator, and I know he has like a very high reputation as far as like these particular bodies of work are concerned, but I don't get it, man. If you really need a super utilitarian translation, sure, go for Fagles. But if you want anything more beautiful or more striking, Fagles is not the way to go, in my personal opinion. So to, kind of wrap this up and bring it back around to what I was saying earlier, despite my lack of enjoyment, if you enjoy Homer, you should probably read this. And considering that there are people who enjoy this more than they enjoyed Homer, I might be wrong on this. So I think this is one that you should settle for yourself, like actually discover for yourself, make your own opinion about it. Definitely don't trust my opinion on this inherently, because I think, as I've kind of explained, that several of these problems that I have with this are my problems and not necessarily problems with the Aeneid. Some of them might be things that I still struggle with if I read a different translation, but I have no way to tell until I reread this at some point in the future. So that is my take on the Aeneid. Let me know your experience with this. If you were somebody who's read the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid, let me know what your experience was, how you would like rank those, and how you would kind of compare them the way that I've been comparing them in this review, because I genuinely want to know how more people felt about these as opposed to myself, because yeah, I struggled with this when I feel like I shouldn't have, and when I really wanted to enjoy it. and I felt like I would. I was confident that I would enjoy it, and then it just didn't work after the first like 4 or 5 books. I was like, this is not really working for me. So yeah, let me know what your experience was, so I can see if I'm an outlier here or if maybe there's someone else who feels similar as me. Let me know all that stuff in the comments below. For now, I have been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.